On the evening of the 7th of February, 1960, at a table in the lounge of the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, a singer introduced a 26-year-old woman to a senator who was running for president of the United States. 7 weeks later, in Florida, the same singer introduced the same woman to a man he called Sam Flood. Sam Flood was not his name. His name was Sam Giancana, and he was the boss of the Chicago outfit. Within 2 months, Frank Sinatra's introductions had produced romances between that woman and a future president, and between that woman and one of the most dangerous criminals in America, and she then spent roughly 2 years carrying messages between them. And in January 1976, when the United States Senate had the chance to put Frank Sinatra under oath and ask him what he thought he was doing, they discussed it and decided not to. That's the story. Not the women, not the Rat Pack, not the drinking or the temper or the 4 marriages, though all of that is in here and none of it is exaggerated. The disturbing thing about Frank Sinatra is that for a period in the early 1960s, he was functioning as the switchboard between the White House and organized crime, and every institution that noticed decided one after another that it was easier not to find out. That is not a rumor, and it is not a theory. It is a sequence of decisions taken by named bodies, and the documents recording those decisions are public. Start with the file, because the file is the spine of everything. The FBI opened on Sinatra when he was still the skinny baritone from Hoboken and the darling of the Bobby Soxers, and it kept going for 40 years. The Bureau produced around 1,300 pages on him and released all but 25 of them after he died. After, not before, which is a detail worth holding on to. 40 years of federal surveillance on a singer, and the first thing they chased was a tip from J. Edgar Hoover's friend, the gossip columnist Walter Winchell, alleging that Sinatra had bought his way out of the Second World War draft. That allegation was false, and Sinatra spent his life being accused of it, and it deserves settling. The doctors told the agents the truth. He had a perforated eardrum, a genuine medical disability, and it was disqualifying. But there is a second half to that finding, and it is one of the strangest paragraphs in the entire file. The man who would become the most famous bon vivant of the 20th century complained to the draft board of being tired a great deal and afraid of crowds, and the draft doctors diagnosed emotional instability and were afraid to put it in their written report because of Sinatra's fame. Read that again because it is 1943 and he had been a national star for about a year. Physicians working for the United States government in wartime altered what they wrote in an official record because the man in front of them was famous. Nobody was bribed. No favor was called in. 2 doctors simply looked at him, wrote down a finding, and then edited the finding on their own initiative because of who he was. That is how it worked around Frank Sinatra for 55 years. He rarely had to apply pressure. People anticipated him, and the anticipating is the thing that should bother you, because it happens again with a Senate committee 33 years later, and the mechanism is identical. Who he was briefly, because the biography matters less than the mechanism, but it explains where the mechanism came from. Francis Albert Sinatra was born in Hoboken, New Jersey in December 1915. An only child of Italian immigrants in a city where that meant something specific and unpleasant. His mother, Dolly, was a local Democratic ward figure and a considerable force. She got out the vote. She knew everybody. She was arrested more than once for performing illegal abortions in the neighborhood. And she is the person who taught her son how power actually works in an American city. That is not a colorful detail. It is the education. Sinatra grew up watching a woman with no formal position deliver votes and collect favors, and understanding that the official structure and the real structure are 2 different things, and that only one of them matters. There is one more thing from Hoboken worth stating, because it explains a great deal about the temper. He was born in a difficult forceps delivery that damaged his face and neck badly enough that he carried the scarring on his left cheek and jaw for the rest of his life, along with the perforated eardrum that would later keep him out of the war. He was a skinny Italian kid with a visibly marked face in a town where being Italian was a liability, and by every account of his childhood, he was fighting constantly. He left school, sang for nothing, sang for tips, joined the Hoboken Four, then Harry James, then Tommy Dorsey, and by 1943 he was the first genuine mass hysteria pop star in American history. The Paramount Theater in New York, the screaming, the riots, 30,000 people in Times Square in October 1944 for a singer. It had never happened before, and it has defined every decade since. And here is the fact people miss about the Dorsey years, because it is where the pattern starts. Sinatra had signed a contract with Tommy Dorsey, giving Dorsey a substantial share of his earnings for years to come, and he wanted out, and Dorsey did not want to let him out. The story that circulated then and has circulated ever since is that the contract was resolved with the help of people who were persuasive. Mario Puzo built a scene in The Godfather on it, the singer, the band leader, the offer that couldn't be refused, and denied for the rest of his life that it was about Sinatra, and nobody believed him, including Sinatra, who confronted him about it in a restaurant. The documented version is less cinematic: lawyers, agents, MCA, and a payout. The undocumented version has never gone away, and that ambiguity, is this a rumor or is this the truth, is the permanent condition of the whole subject. Before the mob, one thing about the fame itself, because the scale of it in 1943 is hard to reconstruct now, and it is the reason everything afterwards was possible. There had been popular singers before him, and there had been screaming audiences before him, but there had never been a single performer around whom the commercial machinery of an entire country reorganized itself. Bobby Soxers queued overnight. The Paramount had to be cleared between shows, and girls refused to leave, sitting through 5 and 6 performances. Newspapers ran think pieces about mass hysteria. Psychiatrists were asked to explain it. And crucially, it happened during a war, to a young man who was not in uniform, in front of an audience of girls whose brothers and boyfriends were overseas, which is where a great deal of the hostility toward him came from, and why the draft rumor had such purchase. He was, for about 2 years, simultaneously the most adored and the most resented man in America, and he was 28. Now the mob, and let me be precise about what is established and what isn't, because Sinatra spent 50 years insisting the whole thing was nothing, and the FBI spent 40 years unable to prove it was something. What is established is that he flaunted the friendships. He was photographed publicly with known mobsters, repeatedly, by choice. His gangster friends shared his interests in gambling and money and nightlife, and they met where those things happen. He was friendly with Sam Giancana, boss of the Chicago outfit. He was photographed at the Westchester Premier Theater with Carlo Gambino and much of the leadership of the New York families in a picture that followed him for the rest of his life. Michael Franzese, a former mobster, has said Sinatra acted as a liaison between the Kennedys and them, especially the men in Chicago, and there is substantial evidence that he served as a social bridge between the two worlds, even though what actually crossed that bridge is disputed. Here is the piece of it that is not disputed, and that almost nobody quotes. In 1950, at a low point in his career, Sinatra sent an associate to J. Edgar Hoover offering his services to the FBI as an informant, and the Bureau declined. Sit with that. The generous reading is that he was frightened of the rumors and wanted cover. The less generous reading is that he was offering to trade access for protection, which is a transaction, and the FBI weighed it and concluded he was not worth it. Either way, he knew enough about the people he was drinking with to think the offer had value, and either way, the federal government declined to take a witness who was volunteering. There is also Havana, December 1946, which people file as legend and which is real. Sinatra flew to Cuba and attended what became known as the Havana Conference, a summit of American organized crime figures convened at the Hotel Nacional with Lucky Luciano present. And he performed, and he was photographed, and he traveled there with the Fischetti brothers, Chicago mobsters and cousins of Al Capone. His explanation then and afterwards was that he had gone for a holiday and to sing and had no idea what else was happening in the hotel. The claim that he carried a briefcase containing $2 million for Luciano comes from Lee Mortimer's reporting and has never been substantiated, so leave it in the unproven column. What is not in the unproven column is the itinerary. A 31-year-old American singer flew to Havana with 2 Chicago mobsters during a summit of the American Mafia and entertained the room. Now, 1960, which is the center of it. Kennedy was running and Sinatra campaigned for him hard, publicly and effectively. He recorded a version of High Hopes as the campaign song. He worked the Italian-American vote and the entertainment industry. And Kennedy's brother-in-law, Peter Lawford, was in the Rat Pack. So the connection was structural rather than incidental. He was, by any measure, one of the most valuable surrogates that campaign had. And it is worth remembering what the Rat Pack actually was in that moment, because it has been softened into nostalgia. 5 men, Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Lawford, Joey Bishop, shooting a film in Las Vegas by day and performing at the Sands by night, in a town substantially owned by organized crime, with the brother-in-law of a presidential candidate standing on the stage. It was the most concentrated overlap of entertainment, crime, and national politics that has ever existed inside one building, and it lasted about 18 months. Sinatra supposedly introduced Giancana into the Kennedy campaign in 1960 in an attempt to deliver Union votes, and according to his own daughter Tina, he played a gig at Giancana's Chicago club to repay the favor. His daughter, on the record, decades later. Then, on the 7th of February, 1960, while he was filming Ocean's 11 by day and performing with the Rat Pack at night, Judith Campbell met Senator John Kennedy at Sinatra's table in the Sands Lounge. Kennedy phoned her constantly afterwards, and they first met privately on the 7th of March at the Plaza Hotel in New York. And in Florida, in late March, Sinatra introduced her to a man called Sam Flood. And it took her a while to work out that Sam Flood was Sam Giancana. The question occurred to people at the time and has never gone away. Was it a coincidence that within a 2-month period, Sinatra's introductions had sparked romances with a future president and with a notorious criminal? And was Giancana being handed a woman precisely because she was Kennedy's girlfriend? Campbell always insisted it never occurred to her. I want to be careful about her, because she has been treated as a punchline for 50 years, and she was a person with a documented and largely verifiable account that she paid for heavily. Aspects of her story are confirmed by documents, phone records, and testimony. Official White House logs record 3 of her visits. She spoke to the president by telephone around 70 times. Her account is specific in dates and detail and is supported by travel documents and her own annotated appointment book. She said she made 10 or 12 courier trips between Kennedy and Giancana and set up a couple of meetings. And her explanation of why she never asked what she was carrying was that Kennedy was the leader of the free world. Castro was the arch-villain of the Western Hemisphere. And Sam, as Kennedy had told her, was working for them. Her accounts did change over the years and became more expansive. And that inconsistency is real and has to be weighed. She lied to the church committee and said afterwards that she had lied out of fear of mafia retaliation. Look at the reason she gave, and then look at what happened to the other witnesses. Sam Giancana was murdered in his own home in 1975, shortly before he was scheduled to appear before that committee. Johnny Roselli was found in a chain-wrapped 55-gallon drum floating in Biscayne Bay after giving his own congressional testimony. Campbell started sleeping with a gun under her pillow. That is the environment in which a young woman was deciding what to say under oath, and she was inconsistent is a fairly thin criticism of somebody in that position. There is a second person in this who deserves naming because the pattern repeats and nobody notices. In December 1963, 3 weeks after Kennedy was killed, Frank Sinatra Jr., 19 years old and singing in a hotel in Lake Tahoe, was kidnapped at gunpoint and held for 2 days. Sinatra paid the ransom, around $240,000, and his son was released unharmed, and the kidnappers were caught within days. And the defense at trial argued that the whole thing had been a publicity stunt arranged by the family, which the jury rejected and which was demonstrably false. But the accusation stuck to Frank Jr. for the rest of his career, and he spent decades being asked about it. That is what proximity to Frank Sinatra did. Even being the victim of a violent crime got read by a substantial part of the public as something his father had probably arranged. The reputation had grown large enough by 1963 that it retroactively contaminated things that happened to the people around him. Subscribe if you want more of these, because the next part is the one that should be the headline and never is. On the 19th of January, 1976, the Associated Press reported that the Senate committee was expected to consider calling Frank Sinatra to testify about the relationship between President Kennedy, Judith Campbell Exner, and Sam Giancana. The report sits in the CIA's own reading room because the agency clipped it and filed it, which is why anybody can read it now. A committee source, the night before the panel met, said the committee needed to consider calling Sinatra as a witness. And then, the following day, the same source said he did not think the staff was eager at that point to go back and open that up again, and that they had decided not to call him because it was doubtful he could add anything. The source acknowledged there had been pressure, including from newspaper columnists, for the committee to question him. Doubtful he could add anything. The man who made both introductions. The man who, on his own daughter's account, played a favor gig at the Chicago Boss's nightclub. The man the FBI had been watching for a quarter of a century by that point. Exner's own book outline, released that same week, put the question plainly, that there may have been a reason beyond what had yet come to light for Sinatra's introduction of her to Kennedy and then to Giancana, and that it was interesting to speculate on whether he had been attempting to set up a connection. Nobody asked him. He was never subpoenaed, never deposed, never placed under oath about any of it, and he died 22 years later without ever answering the question in public. There is one further gap, and it is stranger than the rest. There is no mention of Judith Exner in the Sinatra FBI files at all. The Bureau surveilled him for 40 years. It surveilled Giancana intensively. It knew about Exner and Kennedy. It was famously the FBI informing Kennedy of where her calls were originating that ended the affair in 1962. And the woman at the center of the whole arrangement does not appear in the file on the man who introduced her to both of them. I am not going to tell you what that means. It could be filing practice, it could be the 25 withheld pages, it could be that the Bureau's Sinatra material and its Kennedy material were deliberately kept apart. But it is a hole in exactly the place where the record should be thickest, and holes like that are worth naming even when you cannot explain them. And there is a further piece of context that makes the Kennedy relationship stranger rather than simpler, which is that Sinatra was not a hanger-on. By 1960, he was arguably more famous than the candidate. He had the Oscar, the Capitol albums, the Sands residency, a film production company, and a record label of his own. He founded Reprise in 1960, specifically so that he would own his masters, which almost no artist did at the time, and which was decades ahead of the industry. So the man acting as an intermediary between a senator and a crime boss was not a desperate figure looking for protection. He was, by most measures of American public life, the more powerful of the two men he was introducing. Then Palm Springs, which is where the whole structure collapses. Sinatra invited Kennedy to stay at his house on a trip west and built a helipad to welcome him, and Kennedy declined, reportedly after federal officials raised concerns about Sinatra's mob connections. The president stayed with Bing Crosby instead, a Republican. The detail everybody remembers is that Sinatra reportedly took a sledgehammer to the helipad himself. The rejection devastated him, and it reportedly infuriated Giancana, who had expected Sinatra to be a reliable and permanent connection to the Kennedys. Now think about the position that leaves him in, because this is the genuinely frightening moment in his life, and it has nothing to do with his temper. He had promised the Kennedys to the outfit and the outfit to the Kennedys, Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, then launched the most aggressive prosecution of organized crime in American history, dismantling the very people Sinatra had brought to the table. So the Chicago outfit had been introduced to a politician by Frank Sinatra, had allegedly helped deliver votes for him, and were now being systematically taken apart by that politician's brother. And the man in the middle of that arrangement was a singer with no protection whatsoever except everybody's continued goodwill. He spent the rest of the 60s drifting politically rightward, and by 1970 he was supporting Ronald Reagan, and by 1972, Nixon, and the standard explanation is ideology. The simpler explanation is that the Democrats had humiliated him in front of people who kill. The link to the mob did not end there. In 1970, he appeared with Sammy Davis Jr. at a benefit at Madison Square Garden for the Italian-American Civil Rights League, an organization founded by Joe Colombo, boss of the Colombo crime family. And in 1963, Nevada took his gaming license. He owned a stake in the Cal Neva Lodge at Lake Tahoe. Giancana was in the state's black book and barred from every casino in Nevada. Giancana was seen on the property, and the Gaming Control Board moved. Sinatra raged and threatened, and then, rather than fight a hearing, surrendered his interests in Cal Neva and in the Sands. That is a state regulator successfully imposing a cost on him, and it is one of the very few times in his life that anybody managed it. Except it did not hold, and the way it failed to hold is the best single illustration of this entire story. In 1981, Sinatra applied to have his Nevada gaming license restored, 18 years after surrendering it. Among the letters of support submitted to the Gaming Control Board on his behalf was one from Ronald Reagan, who was at that point the sitting president of the United States. The license was granted, so the one institution in American life that had ever successfully punished Frank Sinatra reversed itself, and the reversal was assisted by a letter from the White House. Now the women, because the reputation is real, it is what most people know about him, and it deserves more than a list of names. The number attached to Sinatra is enormous and mostly undocumentable, which is true of every man with that reputation. What is documented is the roster of women famous enough that the relationship is on the record. Lana Turner, Marlene Dietrich, Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, Angie Dickinson, Juliet Prowse, Kim Novak, Anita Ekberg, Gloria Vanderbilt, and Lauren Bacall, to whom he was briefly engaged. The Bacall episode is the one that tells you most about him. She was a widow. Bogart had recently died. They had been together some months, and he proposed, and when the news reached a gossip column, he stopped speaking to her entirely and permanently, and she discovered the engagement was over by simply never hearing from him again. That is not a man ending a relationship. That is a man withdrawing access, which is a different action, and it is the same one he used on everybody for 50 years. There was also, at the very beginning, an arrest. In November 1938, in Bergen County, New Jersey, Sinatra was charged under a now-defunct statute over a relationship with a woman who turned out to be married. The charge was later amended, and the matter dropped. The reason it matters is not the offense, which was minor and legally obsolete even then. It is that the mugshot exists. It has been reproduced thousands of times, and Frank Sinatra's first appearance in an official American record is a police photograph taken at 22, 18 years before he won an Academy Award, and 5 years before the FBI opened its file. The marriages matter here for a reason that is not gossip. Nancy Barbato, married 1939, divorced 1951, 3 children, and she never remarried. Then Ava Gardner, and that is the one that broke him. They met while he was still married to Nancy. The affair was conducted in public, and it destroyed his image at precisely the moment his career was already sliding. The Bobby Soxer audience had grown up. The Voice was in trouble. Columbia dropped him. MCA dropped him. And the American press turned on him as a homewrecker. He went from the biggest singer in the country to a man who could not get booked in about 3 years. They married in 1951, separated by 1953, divorced in 1957, and by every account, including their own, the relationship was volcanic. Screaming, throwing, public scenes in restaurants and hotels, separations and reconciliations on a monthly cycle. Gardner's own memoir, published after her death, is unsparing about both of them. The comeback is the other half of that story, and he clawed it back himself, which is the thing his detractors never account for. He wanted the part of Maggio in From Here to Eternity badly enough to take it for a fraction of his old fee. He was extraordinary in it, and he won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in 1954. Then he signed with Capitol, worked with Nelson Riddle, and made a run of albums. In the Wee Small Hours, Songs for Swingin' Lovers, Frank Sinatra Sings for Only the Lonely, that essentially invented the idea of an album as a single sustained artistic statement rather than a bag of singles. That is a genuine and permanent contribution to the form made by a 39-year-old who had been finished 2 years earlier. It is also, incidentally, the role Puzo borrowed for the singer in The Godfather, which means the greatest professional recovery in American entertainment history is permanently attached in the public mind to a scene about a severed horse's head. Sinatra never forgave that, and it is one of the few grievances he had that was entirely legitimate. Mia Farrow, married 1966, divorced 1968. He was 50 and she was 21. He reportedly wanted her to stop working. She made Rosemary's Baby anyway, and the divorce papers were served on her at the studio while she was working. Barbara Marx, married 1976, and she was with him until he died. And in between and alongside, there were a great many other women, and the reputation on that front is not exaggerated and was cultivated by him personally. But what the marriages actually demonstrate is the same thing as everything else in this account, which is that nobody said no to him and nothing happened when he behaved badly. Consider what the record shows across 55 years of public life. He assaulted journalists and paid settlements. He lost a gaming license and got it back with a presidential endorsement. He was photographed with the leadership of the American Mafia and kept his film career. He introduced a president to a mob boss's girlfriend and was never questioned about it by anybody. He was surveilled by the FBI for 4 decades and charged with nothing. The only institutions that ever successfully imposed a cost on Frank Sinatra were the Nevada Gaming Control Board for 18 years and Ava Gardner. The violence is documented, and it is not a myth. In April 1947, he assaulted the columnist Lee Mortimer outside a Hollywood nightclub, punched him in front of witnesses over things Mortimer had written, and it cost him a settlement and a stack of terrible press, and it did not stop him. He went on hitting people, or having people hit, for decades. There is a long trail of photographers with broken equipment and journalists with lawyers. In 1967, he lost a fight with a Sands executive named Carl Cohen over a gambling dispute and came out of it missing teeth, which the town enjoyed enormously, largely because it happened so rarely. And in 1974, he arrived in Australia, described the local press in terms that included bums and worse about the women among them. And the Australian trade unions responded by refusing to refuel his aircraft, service his hotel, or move his equipment, effectively grounding him in the country until he issued a statement. It took an entire national labor movement to make Frank Sinatra apologize once. And then, because this is a serious account and not a demolition, the other half of him, which is real and which any honest version has to carry. Frank Sinatra broke the color bar in Las Vegas deliberately, and it is one of the genuinely admirable acts by any American entertainer of that century. In the 1950s, black performers played the Vegas casinos and were not permitted to stay in them, eat in them, or gamble in them. They finished the show and were driven to the west side of town. Sammy Davis Jr., a Rat Pack member, a headliner, and by a distance the most talented performer in that group, could fill a room he was not allowed to sleep in. Sinatra refused to play houses that operated that policy. He had the leverage to make it stick because he was the single biggest draw in the state, and the casinos needed him more than they needed the rule. He used it. Other performers followed, and the policy went. It was not costless either. He was warned it would damage him with Southern bookings and Southern audiences, and it did. He also made a 9-minute short film in 1945 called The House I Live in which he interrupts a group of children chasing a Jewish boy and lectures them about religious tolerance at a moment when that was not a safe thing for a mass-market entertainer to do. It won an honorary Academy Award. He backed civil rights financially and publicly for decades, including funding parts of the movement directly. And Sammy Davis Jr.'s own position inside that group was worse than the general policy, because he was at one point in a relationship with a white actress, and the pressure that came down on him over it, reportedly including from people connected to the Kennedy campaign who wanted it resolved before the election, is one of the ugliest documented episodes of the period. None of the civil rights material is public relations. All of it is documented, and any version of Sinatra that leaves it out is exactly as dishonest as one that leaves out Giancana. And there is one more thing that belongs on that side of the ledger and almost never gets stated, which is that a substantial part of the hostility directed at Sinatra across his life was straightforward ethnic prejudice. The columnists who went after him hardest in the 40s and 50s reached repeatedly for the same vocabulary about Italians and gangsters. And the assumption that an Italian-American entertainer from New Jersey with money and confidence must be connected to organized crime was made about him long before there was any evidence for it. Some of that assumption turned out to be correct in his particular case. That does not retroactively make it good reasoning, and it does not mean the men making it in 1947 knew something. They were guessing on the basis of his surname, and they happened to guess right. And the difference between those two things matters if you care about how conclusions are reached. Both men are the same man, and that is the actual subject of this. The charm and the menace were not two sides of Frank Sinatra. They were one instrument. The reason he could force a casino to integrate is precisely the reason nobody could make him testify. He had accumulated a kind of personal power that operated entirely outside official structures, and personal power does not distinguish between good uses and bad ones. It simply works. He pointed it at segregation in Las Vegas, and it worked. He pointed it at a columnist's face, and that worked too. Which is why the standard argument about him, was he a good man or a bad one, produces nothing and has produced nothing for 70 years. The useful question is what happens to a society when one private individual accumulates that much unaccountable leverage, and the answer in his case was some genuinely good outcomes that no institution had managed to produce. Some genuinely dangerous ones that no institution was willing to stop, and no mechanism whatsoever for telling them apart in advance. Sinatra decided that was the entire system. The last decades were long and comfortable and increasingly strange. He retired in 1971 at 55 and was back within 2 years, which is the most Sinatra sequence available. He toured into his late 70s. He worked with a teleprompter at the end because the lyrics were going. His mother, Dolly, the ward healer from Hoboken who had taught him how the world actually worked, was killed in a plane crash in January 1977, flying to Las Vegas to watch her son perform, and the aircraft went into a mountain in bad weather. He was 61, and by the accounts of everyone around him, he never entirely recovered from it. So where does the record end up? The files are public because he is dead, and that is the only reason. The FBI released them after he died, and not before. 40 years of surveillance produced no evidence of a crime. The agents never found one in his mob connections. Sinatra's own position, given to Walter Cronkite in an interview, was that in theatrical work and nightclub work and concerts you meet all kinds of people, that there was really not much to be said about that, and that the less said, the better. That is the whole defense, and it worked for 50 years. And read carefully, it is also an admission, because a man with nothing to say does not recommend saying less. And it is worth asking why nobody did, because they were scared of him, is too easy and probably wrong. The committee in 1976 was not frightened of a 60-year-old singer. What it was doing was a cost-benefit calculation of a familiar kind. The Kennedy assassination was 13 years old. The country had just come through Watergate. The Church Committee had already delivered enormous damage to the CIA and the FBI, and the appetite in Washington for reopening the private life of a murdered president had run out. Calling Sinatra would have produced a fortnight of headlines about Kennedy and a mobster's girlfriend, and would probably have produced no admissible evidence, because he would simply have said what he said to Cronkite. So they made a judgment about what was worth the trouble. That judgment was reasonable, and it was also how the question died. Institutions do not usually conceal things. They decline to pursue them, on grounds that seem sensible at the time, and the effect is identical. What survives is a strange archive. 1,300 pages of federal surveillance that proves nothing. A CIA clipping about a Senate committee deciding not to ask a question. A woman's annotated appointment book and 70 phone calls. Gaming board records from Nevada and a letter from a president asking for them to be set aside. His daughter's account of a favor gig in Chicago, and no testimony of any kind from the one person who could have explained any of it, because two branches of the United States government looked at the same situation and separately concluded that it was easier not to know. Judith Exner died of breast cancer in 1999 at 65, and her summary of what had happened to her was that she had been crucified for having had the audacity to have an affair with Jack Kennedy. A CBS correspondent who had covered that White House said on her death that he thought she had been used by a number of men, including the president, and that it was a sad story for a beautiful woman. Giancana was shot in his basement before he could testify. Roselli went into the water in a drum after he did. Kennedy was killed in Dallas. And Frank Sinatra sang at Ronald Reagan's inaugural gala, received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1985 and the Congressional Gold Medal in 1997, and died in his bed in Los Angeles in May 1998 at 82. Everybody else in this story either testified and died, or died before they could testify. He was never asked. Not by the bureau that watched him for 40 years, not by the committee that spent 2 weeks deciding whether to, not by any prosecutor in any jurisdiction at any point. The most surveilled entertainer in American history, and the question at the center of it was never once put to him out loud.